Okay, now it's recording. Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. So my name is Shelley, and along with Eleanor and Imogen, we are hosting this discussion panel, all for one, for careers in infant mental health. And just a bit of background to us. So we're currently postgraduate students studying a master's in developmental psychology and psychopathology at King's College London. And alongside this, we recently completed a placement at the Parent Infant Foundation, and this really granted us great insight into the importance of the field of infant mental health. And so our experience has motivated us to kind of deliver this event today to really highlight the importance and the range of careers in the sector. And so with the contributions from our four panelists listed on the slide that you're seeing right now, we hope to highlight the range of careers available to the next generation of professionals. And so before I introduce our four panelists, we would like to provide you with some background context to the purpose of this session. And so we'll start with what is infant mental health. So broadly, it refers to the social and emotional development of children in the earliest years of life. And it is their capacity to regulate and express emotions, form secure and supportive relationships, and to explore the environment, which ultimately lays the foundation for lifelong physical and mental health. And so why is infant mental health so important? Well, the first 1,001 days of life from conception to age 2 is really a period of rapid growth and development, but it is also one in which babies are most vulnerable. And so research has found that social and emotional well-being during these early years is strongly linked to later outcomes. And therefore strengthening these relationships between parents and their offspring plays a pivotal role in ensuring that all babies have the best possible start in life. And so early intervention to support these relationships not only benefits the families themselves, but also the economy and society as a whole. So despite the clear importance of early intervention, there's currently very limited provision in this area, which is highlighted by these statistics, which show that although CAM services should provide support for all children between the ages of 0 to 18, in a recent report published by the Parent Infant Foundation as part of Infant Mental Health Awareness Week, just over half of respondents to the survey reported that their local NHS child and adolescent mental health service accepted referrals for children aged 2 and below. And also only 9% of respondents felt that there was sufficient provision available for babies and toddlers whose mental health was at risk. Additionally, 31% of mental health practitioners who completed this survey feel they do not understand infant mental health, rating their understanding is only 1 out of 5. And regarding workforce gaps, it is estimated that 300 teams are needed to meet the demand for infant mental health. But currently, only 13% of this demand is being met, with 39 specialist parent-infant relationship teams that have been established across the UK. So I hope that this has provided you with a better understanding of what infant mental health is, the current situation, and really the importance of raising awareness throughout this whole week, and to really give infants a compelling voice. And so the format to follow in this discussion is the discussion, which will be for around 45 minutes until 8 o'clock. And that will be led by Eleanor. And then we'll open up the floor to any questions for the audience to ask our panelists. And this will be facilitated by Imogen. So please do enter any questions you have in the chat box, and we'll come to those at the end of the session. Okay. Okay, so I'll stop sharing my slides now. And hopefully you can see all our panelists. So I'd like to introduce our panelists now. So we have Dr. Gemma Dibble, who is a consultant clinical psychologist for the Leeds Infant Mental Health Service, which supports early relationships families with infants aged 0 to 2 and also expecting parents. Gemma also works closely with professionals offering reflective case discussions, consultations and training to upskill the workforce. We have Sally Hogg, who is the head of policy and campaigning at the Parent Infant Foundation, where she leads work to raise awareness for the importance of early relationships and to drive change at both the local and national level. And as part of her work, Sally also coordinates the 1001 Days movement and the Conception to Age 2 all-party parliamentary group. We also have Dr. Michael Jalbraith, who has trained as a clinical psychologist and systemic psychotherapist and currently leads the Parent-Baby Relationship Service and the Growing Together project in Liverpool. Michael has increasingly appreciated strengthening families and communities alongside supporting parents to facilitate their child's development. And finally, we have Dr. Vaheshtha Setna, who is a lecturer in psychiatry and mental health education at King's College London. Her research examines biopsychosocial and familial processes and links perinatal, parental mental health to child's development. So I hope that the career insights offered by each of our four panelists inspire and resonate with the audience. And I hope you can take away something from the session at the end. I will now pass over to Eleanor, who will facilitate the discussion.
Thank you, Shelley, and hi again to everybody. Thank you for your presentation and your introduction, Shelley. As you said, my name is Elena, and I'm very honored to be moderating the panel today. So I'll just remind everybody to please put your questions in the chat if you have any, and at the end there will be a session where we will try to get to all of them. So until we get to that, we'll start off with some general questions and then try to facilitate a discussion. So first, I'd like to say that we recognize that while all of your careers surround infant mental health, they also reflect the wide range of careers that are possible in this field. Yet they certainly still have their differences. So we would first like to ask about your current roles. Vaheshtha, would you please be able to start us off by telling us a little bit about what a typical day looks like in your profession?
Thank you, Elena, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. And thank you, Shelley, for a really lovely introduction. My day, that's a really, really interesting question. So as Shelley introduced me, I'm Vaheshtha. I'm a lecturer at King's College, and my day involves a range of different aspects from research. So the work that I do, I work across a range of different studies, and mainly these studies look at and try and identify some of the risk and resilience factors that might be linking and helping us to understand links between mums and dads who are unwell during pregnancy and postpartum and children's development. So I look at relationships between infant and their parents in my research. A typical day involves supervising and working alongside a range of different colleagues, students, PhD students, MSc students. I also, I'm involved in running and I'm a program lead for an MSc in developmental psychology and psychopathology. So I'm involved in a lot of the teaching, the admin, working alongside students and the wider IOP where I'm based and King's. So my role is sort of a combination of a range of different tasks. It also involves a lot of writing and thinking, writing grants and papers, dissemination of our research, and also sort of liaising with colleagues and collaborators. And this is something at a sort of a different stage in my career, is the opportunity to work alongside and with a range of different colleagues. And I think COVID has allowed, alongside its challenges, it's allowed us in the last year to actually liaise with a range of different colleagues, not just, I would say, locally, nationally, but also internationally. And I think that's kind of brought a bit more excitement in my day-to-day work. So we actually have opportunities for now working with students as well as with colleagues internationally. And I would say it comes into my day-to-day work, whereas previously it was a grant or a paper, and you occasionally interacted with colleagues from across the globe, but now it's a lot more. So that kind of covers some of the tasks that I'm involved in. Lots of meetings online, lots of have the opportunity to be involved in quite a lot of I would say groups and working groups across the Institute of Psychiatry, working groups in relation to diversity and inclusion, global mental health. So yes, my day is quite varied.
Yes, that's very interesting, because it sounds like your title doesn't quite capture all that you do. And I'm sure that with COVID, like many people's jobs, things have changed. So maybe this question is very interesting in terms of how things are right now. And I'm actually very glad that you brought COVID up. Next, I would like to ask Michael, if that's okay, to give us a clinical perspective, and maybe also in terms of how COVID has changed your clinical practice.
Okay. Just out of interest, what length of answer do you want for this for your question?
Anything you think that will give people an idea of what they should expect if they were to go into a career like yours.
Okay. I guess our service context is a bit unusual in that our main contract at the moment is with Liverpool City Council, so working with families under social care or on the edge of social care. So they are very vulnerable, relatively high-risk families. So, for instance, this afternoon, I attended a Team Around the Family meeting regarding a family where there are a couple of older children and a baby's just been born. And when the older children were born, mum did things which physically abused the children in a way which gave her the label of fabricated induced illness, which she was found guilty of, and couldn't have contact, had limited contact with the older children for 3 or 4 years, and then moved back into the family home. She had therapy at that time. There's been a gap, and now she's had another child, and social services are concerned that the arrival of another baby might trigger a similar reaction in mum as she had when she had the older children. So we're trying to put together a package of support to help mum and dad and mum's mum to make sure that things are safe enough and good enough in terms of mum expressing her emotional needs and of course tuning into the baby's emotional needs. So that's a kind of a slightly more extreme clinical example. Generally, I'm working with families where there's some some strain on the parent-baby relationship, and that could be for a variety of reasons. Historical factors, we talk about ghosts in the nursery, we talk about how the parent's own experience of being parented affects how they then parent their baby. If you've had good experiences as a child, you can repeat those with your own children, and that's fine. If you've had bad experiences, you might want to get away from that pattern, to break that intergenerational cycle. But knowing how to do that can be difficult, and the emotional drivers can be very powerful. There can also be more contemporary factors to do with the circumstances around the conception. Obviously, babies conceived as a result of sexual assault or violence carry a kind of reminder of that. Difficult pregnancies, difficult births, or families who are kind of experiencing a lot of change, maybe who have arrived in this country seeking asylum. There can be lots of things that get in the way of the parent being able to focus fully on the child. And so we work with the parent and the baby together, or parents and sometimes the extended family and the baby, to help people tune in to where the baby's at developmentally, emotionally, socially. I'll pause there. Is that making sense?
It does make sense. And I think that you're saying that even though we're talking about infant mental health and careers in infant mental health, you probably tend to work a lot with parents. I mean, we, of course, in order to get them to think through or work through their psychopathology and their parenting.
There's a famous
No, go ahead, please.
There's a famous quote from Winnicott, which is, "There's no such thing as a baby. If you try and describe a baby, you'll find yourself describing a nursing dyad," was Winnicott's original quote. I would actually go further than that, and you know, in the African expression that it takes a village to raise a child, that that babies exist in systems that I think it's extremely difficult for a parent to bring up a child all by themselves without a support network of some kind, whether that be family or friends. I think that's been one of the really stressful things about the lockdown with you know, COVID, coronavirus, is the isolation and the separation of people from their support systems. And that's something that a lot of parents have said to us, that they're looking forward to getting back to children's centres, to getting back to seeing wider and extended family. And in cases where they don't have that, then we try and think with them about how they can build that.
Mm-hmm. I guess, thank you for this. And thank you for giving me the example in the beginning. Gemma, could you, as a clinical psychologist as well, could you give us some insight about your work and what a day looks like in your while working, or in general what your career looks like more generally, because I realize that one day may not capture exactly what you do as a whole.
Yeah, thank you. It's incredibly varied, and I think that's probably what's really quite exciting about this field as well, that it is variable. It keeps it really interesting, but it is quite a very innovative and dynamic kind of field, which you can potentially get involved in lots of things, which is great. But then it can be really hard to describe what a typical day is. I think also, so I'm new into a consultant role from August, being on maternity leave, and going into a new role during COVID times, and also a new role for the service as well. So there is something about things being kind of shaped over the last few months while I've been in post. However, there are things, I guess, that are quite standard as a consultant, and that will be things around kind of clinical pathways. So thinking about, are we delivering kind of effectively and efficiently to our families, and ensuring that part of my job is to kind of review that and seeing if we are doing that, or if we're not, making some changes, thinking about policies and practices that can support that as well. I do offer some kind of direct clinical work as well, although that's a small caseload. So what I typically would do instead is be offering supervision and be offering in-house training to kind of support colleagues within the service. We have paused at the moment through COVID our normal kind of training package, because what we have realised that we're a small resource and we want to make a big impact. So it is about trying to upskill the workforce and offering kind of support there. So we've offered some bits of training, but not our standard kind of one-day face-to-face training. However, what we're thinking about at the moment and what we're actively doing is how can we reshape that so we can offer it maybe as a virtual platform. And I think that's maybe what's helpful about COVID as well, is the way that we were doing things, were they always that effective? Or can we think about kind of new ways of working? And again, that's part of my role as well, to be thinking about how do we develop these packages of training and upskilling the workforce. We offer reflective case discussions as well. So it is another area where we kind of try and help colleagues. A big part of my work is meetings and lots of meetings. But that's part of that kind of strategic side of the job. And it's thinking about how do we ensure that the infants remain kind of firmly in the heads of commissioners, professionals, other key workers. So it is about embedding those key messages kind of locally and nationally, and making sure that the infant continues to be heard. And although that can feel quite draining at times, it's really helpful when we do have meetings where we are able to kind of very much keep the voice of the infant there and present. Sometimes we might need to shout it, but it feels helpful to be then kind of having a strategic planning with that, and ensuring that different services are talking to each other, so they are kept firmly in mind. But it is, yeah, it's bearable. And actually coming back to a job that is 3 days a week instead of full time, it's actually trying to think about balancing that as well.
It sounds variable as it is now, but it also sounds variable across time. Maybe you started more within a clinical practice and now you do work that surrounds policy, and it leads perfectly into asking Sal about your own work and maybe what you're involved with and what you do and how you came into this work too.
Thanks. So I work at the Parent Infant Foundation, which is a small national charity that supports the development of teams like the ones that Michael and Gemma work in, so specialised parent-infant relationship teams. And my role is our policy and campaigning kind of function. So that is, how do we get kind of national decision makers, so NHS England, the Department of Health, ministers, to make the changes that will mean that more of those teams are available for babies that need them all around the country. So as was mentioned at the start, there's coming up to 40 of those teams around the UK, and we want them to be available everywhere. But we've got a long way to go until we get there, because not only does that mean kind of the technical stuff that gets a team in place in terms of money and people and commissioning guidance, but actually there's a lot of stuff behind that, because we need to get policymakers and decision makers to understand what infant mental health is, to understand why it's important, to understand that to get infant mental health right, you need to invest in relationships and to take actions to get there, and to prioritise that when there's a lot of other stuff going on as well. So I have to think about what are the levers we can pull that might make that happen, and then to actually pull them. So we're doing that in a number of ways. I kind of wear two hats. So we coordinate a big campaigning alliance of lots of charities called the First 1,000 Days Movement. And that's kind of ranges from really tiny grassroots, mum and baby groups, through to the big sort of children's charities like NSPCC and Action for Children. And we try and campaign together to say to policymakers, look, babies matter. Pregnancy in the first 2 years of life are really important, and they're very, very often forgotten about. Very often children's policy thinks about kind of verbal, vocal kind of school-age children, and particularly that's been really clear in the pandemic. So we do a lot just to put babies kind of on the agenda, and then we do some more technical stuff about the need for services and the need for the NHS and children and young people's mental health services to think about the youngest children. So what does that actually look like? Well, I can tell you a few things we've been doing this last week, which are really illustrative. So obviously it's Infant Mental Health Awareness Week, so it's been really busy. We released new research that Shelley talked about at the start, showing gaps in services. So I had to kind of think about, well, what bit of research would be quick and easy for us to do, but get some good results that we can talk about on a national stage. So I designed and conducted that survey and then wrote it up into a report and got the report published. I then worked with our comms team to get that out to the press. So Saturday morning I was away in the Peak District, but I was stood on the side of a hillside talking to BBC Radio Teesside's breakfast programme, because, you know, whenever any media comes in, you do it, you talk to it. Last night I was on the phone to a Telegraph journalist. So you're kind of constantly kind of trying to seek those opportunities to spread the word. This morning I was presenting in Parliament on Zoom. Sadly, my life was much more excited when I left moved more than 3 meters from my own kitchen. But so I was on Zoom talking to a group of parliamentarians in what's called an all-party parliamentary group. So that's a group of parliamentarians from across different parties with a shared interest. We coordinate that group for Conception to 2. So I organised that meeting, get people there, and then I was doing a little bit of the presentation, although most of it was far better speakers who I'd organised to be there. And that was thinking specifically about how some changes to the health service might affect what's delivered for babies. So I did that first thing. The middle of the day, I was talking on an Instagram live. So we were on Happy Mum, Happy Baby, which is a Giovanna Fletcher Instagram posts, talking to parents. And I was working with another of our clinical psychologist partners from around the country to do that. And then this afternoon, I was speaking at an event for local authority leaders. So 70 local authority early years leaders from around the country, to get them to think about what are they doing in their local area for babies. So kind of you'll see that, you know, trying to pitch to different audiences, people who can make change locally. The public, we don't very often do public facing stuff because we're not trying to change directly what parents are doing, we're trying to get support for them. But sometimes raising awareness amongst the public is what puts pressure on decision makers. And then the kind of either before this, very public work with parliamentarians and stuff behind the scenes as well. So we also today, for example, sent a letter to the mental health minister asking her to meet us, sharing the new results with her. So lots of different stuff, but all with that aim of trying to get the people who hold the purse strings or who make the big decisions to prioritise babies.
That makes me think that it's probably very intimidating for somebody to enter this world. And so I guess my next question is, now that we have set the stage about what each of you do, I want to ask you, while I still have you on, how did you prepare for this role, and what advice would you give to somebody potentially considering it? And even though it's intimidating, how could they go about entering it with confidence?
Shall I start? I know I've just spoken, but so I guess, the biggest thing to say is you don't start on day one doing the sort of stuff I've just described. So it doesn't need to be that intimidating. I think I took a sort of fairly different route. So my kind of story is that if I go all the way back to kind of thinking about careers, I had really poor careers advice at school, and it was basically, if you were bright, you were going to be a lawyer or a doctor. That was like those are the only two pathways available. So I was going to be a doctor, chose all my A-levels, did some work experience because I thought I had to apply to med school. I thought, actually, I don't want to be a doctor. But what that work experience gave me was a really good insight into what I now know is called, I didn't as a 17-year-old, this kind of social determinants of health, and so I did some work experience in a really disadvantaged community and got really interested in kind of why those people were turning up at their GP and what else was going on for them. So I knew I wanted to work in something around people and people's health and well-being, but not kind of frontline. I didn't think my skills were best as kind of being on the front line. So I studied what's called PPP at Oxford, so psychology, physiology and philosophy. And I got a lot of choice in that, and I really loved developmental psychology. Just thought it was brilliant, fascinating, and really brought to life the fact that we're so shaped by our experiences. And I also did a bit of kind of, in my philosophy bit of my degree, a lot of kind of political stuff and ethics. So that landed me at wanting to work in something around public policy and politics and childhood and getting things right for kids. So at the end of my degree, I applied to the civil service fast stream, and I went to work in the Department for Education, but in children's policy. And I had a range of roles in the UK, and I also did this comment to Australia, looking at different aspects of children and support for children's policy and children and families, and also quite a lot of work on child poverty. I worked there till 2010, and then I thought, actually, 2 reasons I want to get out. One, I think I'm a bit too passionate about this to be a civil servant. I just don't think I can keep saying yes, minister, whoever the ministers are and whatever they want to do. And the other reason was that I thought that actually, having done Oxford and the civil service, I didn't really understand the real world that I was trying to influence. And so I decided to go out and work in the charity sector, and got a fantastic job at NSPCC focusing on services for 0 to 2-year-olds. So that's when my real passion for the earliest years of life started. And since then, so the last kind of decade, I've been in the charity sector. And I guess going back to what Gemma said as well, I'm also part-time. I just work 3 days a week because I've got 2 small children. And the brilliant thing about the charity sector is there's loads of very flexible roles, partly because there's not loads of money slushing around. So if they want senior people, often they get, you know, they can't afford the full-time, and part-time is perfect. So it's a really nice way of balancing a really exciting job and family life as well.
That's amazing. Thank you. Gemma, would you mind telling us a little bit about how your education and training prepared you for your career all throughout?
I think it might be helpful to also talk about not having a straightforward career pathway, which is what I experienced. And maybe, again, going back to the beginning. So I was born into a kind of low-income single-parent family, where actually it wasn't good enough parenting. And it was, I think what was also quite helpful was Michael talked about ghosts in the nursery. There are angels in the nursery as well. And I think alongside one of my angels was that I've got a twin sister. And I found it incredibly fascinating to be thinking about human behaviour even from such a young age. So thinking about, you know, there's 2 people that are brought up in a seemingly kind of similar environment, although I think there's definitely different experiences that we both had, but also academically how we can be so different, and thinking about, yeah, the academic side of things, but also the confidence side of things and the relationship. So I think very early on, those kind of experiences helped me to be quite curious about the world and human behaviour and why things are different. And I went, not so much bad careers advice, but I did A-level psychology, and with teachers that hadn't done it before, so we were guinea pigs. And although it was something I was really interested in with psychology, it kind of put me off that career. So instead I went down the kind of business studies route, and then found that incredibly not so satisfying. So retracked to something, criminology, found that really interesting as well, but then came to the end of my degree and thought, well, what am I going to do now with criminology? And there's only a few kind of different areas that you can go into with that. So I think I went off to Japan actually and did some time out there, did some teaching, thinking about what do I really want to do. Came back with my criminology degree and started to work in the prison service. So again, kind of started to think about forensic psychology, and with the Open University course, did my psychology degree. And then was thinking back again with those early experiences that I had, and also kind of seeing the women that I worked with in prison. It was also, there were also infants, babies there as well, and juveniles, and just thinking this is just too late. You know, we can make some differences, but it just felt that there was so many things kind of against these kind of women, that were able to make some choices, but actually life had really got in the way, and it was hard to see some changes. So then went to the Open University, did my psychology degree, and thought clinical psychology was the way forward, which is really helpful for doing the doctorate in clinical psychology, because you look at the different lifespan, and it gives you a really nice experience of maybe the populations that you'd like to work with, and where's the best fit really for you. So following the doctorate, I was lucky enough to go straight into a job in Wolverhampton. So that was, I guess, another experience that I was willing to travel around the country at the time, and I was able to do that. So I knew that early years and prevention and early intervention was where I wanted to be. And I was fortunate enough that I could relocate to Wolverhampton to really start my career in infant mental health. But I know that that's not an option for everybody. And sometimes we might need to maybe not quite work in the area that we want to, if it's infant mental health, for example, but there's other opportunities like working in CAMS, working in adult services that often there are infants and babies there as well. Or if it's not working kind of in the NHS, but it's working elsewhere, that will still give you that experience. And I guess being an auntie for many years really helped prepare me for this role. And then the last 2 years, actually being a mother myself has helped. But I guess we've all been parented. So we've all had experiences of that, and many of us are kind of parents, or we are aunties or uncles, brothers and sisters. So we have that experience of what it's like to be an infant as well. So maybe that's kind of helpful in terms of saying that it's not always a straight path that you can lead that can still get you to where you want to in the end. And actually, what was helpful is when I came to where I am now, I had lots of experience in various areas and places that has kind of really helped me to do this role, I think, more effectively.
Mm. And it sounds like through every stage both of you found what you liked and let that guide your next step. Yeah. And actually this fits well with my next question to Vaheshtha, and how academic research can take on many different forms. And we can imagine that somebody should have to be interested in what they're researching in order to make a career out of it. So we'd like to ask you, how did your interests throughout shape your career, and how do you strike a balance between what is in demand to be researched and your own personal interests?
That's a really good question. I guess it's my passion, and I guess it's a combination between when I think about sort of my research interests, it's I never started off thinking about or researching or working in infant mental health or sort of perinatal mental health. My sort of earlier training was in child and adolescent health and development and family relationships. My research was sort of child and adolescent relationships, but then having embarked on sort of a PhD, I kind of was drawn into earlier time points and was drawn into sort of infancy and pregnancy. And I guess at the time, there wasn't that much work much earlier in terms of research, work much earlier within pregnancy and right after birth. I would say this was sort of mid-90s to late 90s. So what really drove my interest in infant mental health was, I guess, the building of ideas. So a particular research project that I was initially involved in was the mental health of fathers, and how they contributed to maternal and infant mental health and development, and trying to understand how fathers relate to their babies and how they bond with their infants. And I guess with that sort of earlier training and research experience, it went on to the next stage of my career, which was thinking about, well, I'd studied early relationships, and then thinking about what could be various different aspects in sort of the child's environment. And I think one of the speakers alluded to this, that, you know, it's a range of different aspects that can sort of have an impact on relationships. And I began to think about and joined a team which was primarily looking at biological development. So I began linking my previous training in early relationships with biology and sort of the biological biopsychosocial aspects of development, to look at how various risk factors in the child's environment, infant's environment, which could involve social, environmental, genetic risks, kind of work together and have an impact on development. So I guess it's the ideas have snowballed, the curiosity has developed, the opportunities to link with colleagues from a range of disciplines. Not everyone is an expert in a particular discipline or in a range of disciplines, but it's keeping the mind open to a range of disciplines, working alongside and with a range of expertise, kind of building that research momentum. So that's kind of been, and to some extent, I think, and this is quite an individualized approach, but mine has been, I've been involved in things that I'm really quite passionate about. So although there are loads of challenges when you're working in an academic research environment, the pressure to obtain funding and grants and to write papers but I've kind of always been a bit laid back and gone with my passion and gone with what's really interested me. It's really difficult to do that, but I've had the opportunity to in the role that I have, so which I'm really quite grateful for. So I think that's really helped me to develop my research thinking, my career in line with my passion and my needs, but also I suppose thinking about the wider context in which I'm working. Does that answer your question, Eleanor?
Yes, it does.
It may have veered off a little bit, but
this is why it's a discussion. So there's not a problem, and it's nice to hear all of this. And I'd like to ask Michael too. I think that there was an experience early on that sparked your interest in infant mental health. So we would like to ask you a little bit about that and maybe how it felt to enter a female-dominated field.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure which early experience you're thinking about. I'm gonna pick up on Gemma's lead of just sharing a little bit kind of personally. So my parents are both Canadian. So in terms of extended family and network, they were quite isolated when they had me and my brother. So they kind of built a network around themselves rather than having biological family nearby. They got divorced when I was about 6 or 7. I'm the older of 2 children. And I think that kind of seeded a fascination with, an interest in, a desire to try and help children in situations that they find difficult. I think I sort of took on the role of family therapist at about the age of 7. And then my professional training sort of caught up with me, caught up with that many years later. I mean, I don't know whether I'm the oldest here. I think I might be. So, back in the day, there weren't very many parent infant mental health teams around the country. So there wasn't a career pathway as such. Although we do need to mention child psychotherapy, and none of us are child psychotherapists, but I think they would point out that they've been working with parents and babies for a long time. So there's a psychodynamic, psychoanalytic tradition, which is probably one of the oldest in terms of career pathways and so on. So just want to kind of acknowledge that option. I went to university and did natural sciences, fell into psychology, looking around for how to use that, I came across clinical psychology, did clinical psychology on a course that was very CBT. So of course I came out with a love of systemic practice. And you know, during my clinical psychology training, as Gemma mentioned, you work across the age range, and it became clear to me that I wanted to work with children and families. And then I've kind of gradually worked down the age range as my career's gone on. I think the formative influence that you're talking about, Eleanor, is working in a Sure Start local program. I worked in Sure Start, West Everton and Breckfield. And that focus on strengthening families and strengthening communities, which was the fourth objective of the Sure Start local program, really changed my view of things. And I became interested in, you know, the community context that families live in, as well as the, you know, what's going on within the parent-child dyad. And yeah, and that kind of extended that. So I think kind of a mixture of personal, I use my systemic training a lot. I think that parent-infant work is a version of family therapy, which may or may not be controversial for some people, but I certainly use the kind of the skills that I developed in that area in my clinical work. Yeah.
Thank you. No, it sounds like all of you followed a combination of your passion, what was needed, what is and needed in terms of, you know, what infants need from professionals in order to be best heard. So that makes your work very meaningful. And although we all have many questions, I'm aware that in 5 minutes the Q&A will start. So to finish off, maybe I will ask each of you some advice. What would be some advice to somebody who is considering this field in terms of, you know, from your perspective and your background and how you see the field moving forward? Maybe advice on what to do to prepare and enter it, or what to pursue next at whatever stage they are. Let's see, Gemma, can we start with you, please?
Eleanor, we could do this. I'm just noticing that there's already a few questions in the Q&A about advice. So whether whether there's other questions you want to ask, because I think it naturally come into the Q&A. Right.
Okay. So, okay. Oh, there is one. So since you work in both within clinical practice and consulting professionals, how do these two come together in bringing infant mental health to the forefront with children and young people's mental health?
Do you want me to start then?
Yes, please.
I guess if I've understood your question right, it's kind of how does our direct clinical work kind of fit in with our training that we offer as well, and how do they mix? Yeah. I think, like I said before, because we're a small resource, we want to make a big impact. It's almost a big field of kind of our attendees for training is health visitors, early years, kind of midwives. So it's highlighting kind of awareness of maybe what infant mental health is, but also how important that kind of relationship work could be. And what we want to what we're hopefully doing is that giving the workforce confidence, I think, some kind of skills and experience of being able to offer some of that mini work on a universal level, and how can they already put that in their practice, and keeping the infant in mind. So for example, at the moment we're offering training around the early attachment observation. So health visitors do a 6 to 8 week contact, and we've offered training about how can they kind of highlight whether there are any concerns in the relationship, how can they have these conversations with parents, with caregivers, about what they're observing, what they're seeing, things that they might be able to do a bit differently. Is it something that they can be offering with the work that they're already doing, or does it have to go to a specialist service? Because ultimately we'd want them to be kind of working about relationships with relationships that they've already established, rather than feeling that they have to go to a specialist service. Sometimes that has to happen because that's what's needed, but there might also be, there's a lovely manual at the moment that's being developed that's called Watch Me Play, and it's open to all kind of professionals to be able to use. Even families can use it on their own if they want to, but talking to health visitors in particular, but other professionals, about being able to access this manual that is really helping to have the infant in mind. So, you know, during play, helping to encourage the infant leading the play, for example. Often I think as parents, we're really eager to teach within our play, but then ultimately we're not following the lead of the infants. And it's a really nice, straightforward manual that that parents or other professionals can look at and just help model some of that, help describe what they might be thinking, the infants thinking, describing what they might be doing. But it's a really nice way of actually doing some mini kind of interventions, but already with relationships that they've got established. And health visitors in particular are really great at being able to have access to all families. And it's a really nice way of bringing some of the work that we do. So yeah, I think that might be how they naturally intertwine with each other. That there's our direct clinical work that, like I say, is much more specialised and needs trained clinicians to be able to offer that work. But we'll do a lot of upskilling the workforce through the training, through reflective case discussions, through our duty calls, and sometimes through supervision to help kind of as many families as possible access the work that we do.
Thank you. And for our very last, yes, Michael.
Is that all right if I jump in?
Of course.
Just, kind of add to that one of the kind of, I think, special things about infant mental health is that all of the people that we're talking with, whether it's other professionals, parents, commissioners, have an experience of infant mental health. So whereas if you're talking to a commissioner about dementia services, they may or may not have had some contact with somebody with experiencing dementia. They almost certainly won't have experienced dementia themselves. And that's fundamentally different with infant mental health. Every adult has had an infant mental health, and that can be both a facilitator and a challenge when talking with people, because they may be more or less aware of the influence of that on their understanding of these needs and these processes. So when you're talking with, as I say, professionals and commissioners, in a way you're talking to their adult self, but you're also talking to their infant self, and their infant self may be affecting how they hear what the kind of ideas that we're sharing. So I think there's a kind of there's an extra dimension in the kind of work that we do. So when we're doing consultation and the kind of training and strategic stuff, we're never actually totally removed from the clinical eye as well.
Sal or Vaheshtha, do you have anything to add to this? I think this is a really interesting point.
No, I think Gemma and Michael have done great, and I can see there's lots of questions, so we can probably move on today.
Of course. Thank you all for participating in the discussion, and thank you for letting me moderate this and talk with you.
No, well done.
Okay, so thank you, Eleanor, for that. We're now going to move on to the Q&A section of the event. So if you have any questions, then feel free to type it in the chat, which some of you already have. And there's also a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen if you would like to use that instead. But as I said, we already have a few questions. So I'll begin with two, what was sent in by Abigail. And the first one is what led the panelists into working in this field, which has loosely been touched upon. But if you guys have any other comments you'd like to add, then that'd be greatly appreciated. And secondly is what is the most challenging part of your role? Vaheshtha, do we want to start with you or anyone?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think sometimes the challenges of the role, it sort of overlaps with one of the questions that we've received in terms of perhaps the stress and anxiety linked to deadlines around academic deadlines, even for academics. So deadlines for grants, deadlines for meeting a range of other research academic responsibilities. So I guess one of the key challenges is being able to multitask and being able to, I guess it's not a challenge, but it's being able to find how do you get across that challenge of a range of different work responsibilities is being able to find your own rhythm in some sense, being able to go with your flow in relation to how to deal with the challenge of a range of different deadlines and sort of anxieties and stresses around those. Other challenges in the role, I guess I'm the sort of person to always see my glass a bit full rather than empty, and that's what keeps me going in the role also. But often there could be challenges in terms of also dealing with different personalities within a team, working on your projects or working on educational curricula, different priorities, and how do you negotiate those difficult situations, how to work with a range of different personalities in the team can be challenging. How do you communicate if your point across in a way that if it's something which is quite out of the box. One of the challenges is also being able to think creatively within the role. And as much as it's a challenge, it's also a facilitator in the role. But some academics and researchers, because of the organized way of thinking, and I guess I'm talking about myself, there might be challenges of being a lot more creative, which demands of various different aspects of the job. So I guess, yes, I kind of look through my challenges as in what are the solutions? How can I be thinking creatively to find a solution to some of my challenges, if that makes sense? And that's by, and I guess by embracing your challenge in a way, when I embrace a challenge, it's in a sense, it involves a certain amount of growth in the position itself, in the work that you're doing. And often that in itself is from a personal point of view, quite empowering in any role that you're in, whether it's in a research academic role or a role linked to policy or clinical work. To some extent, being able to embrace that challenge in itself at any point in your career, whether it's thinking about writing an essay, just moving to that next step in your thinking, in itself is empowering. Yeah.
No, I completely understand. And I guess with a lot of challenges, with any role, you'll face them, but it's just how you approach it, rather than letting it discourage you, allowing that to just trust the process. And yeah.
And in any role, there will be the pros and the cons in any role that you are. For me, it's how do I negotiate a range of challenges, whether they are personal, institutional, to really make the most of the situation that I am in.
Amazing. Anyone else have any comments for that?
I'm happy to share challenges if it would be helpful. I mean, I think one of the things for me is, what I love about my role, I'm in a very small organisation, I'm in a leadership position, there's so much autonomy and possibility out there. I think one of the things you find in your career is if you're a big organisation or a small organisation person, I like small organisations because we can be quick, but it also means you don't have a lot of resource. And that, and I work 3 days a week, and one of the things is there's so much opportunity and so much kind of interesting stuff happening. It's how do you get that down to what, you know, really focus on the priorities. And I think in some ways, if you're really passionate about your job and you enjoy it, that almost becomes harder. You know, and the things people are offering you and you have to say no to are things that kind of personally excite you, and you want to do and you think are important. Those kind of getting those boundaries. And the pandemic for me has made that really hard, because I had to kind of lose my boundaries. I had to start, you know, working and balancing kids at the same time, and sometimes putting the kids in front of the telly while I worked, which I never would have done before. You know, I worked and then I had them at different times, and getting those boundaries is really can be quite difficult. It's all very doable, but I think that's one of the things. And the other thing about policy and campaigning roles, the other thing that can be challenging is if you've got a government that just isn't going to budge on stuff or doesn't seem to care. And, you know, there are days when particular parliamentarians say particular things or don't say them, or espouse particular policies. And you just want to, you know, you just feel like you bang your head against a wall, and you just want to cry about, you know, some of the stuff that's happened to kids over the last year. And I just have to, you know, you have to find ways to channel that into appropriate anger. So, and I think, you know, whenever you're passionate about, whether you're talking to national politicians or just, you know, your own line manager, sometimes we all in our careers have to find ways to channel our passion. But in policy and campaigning, there's definitely that balance of kind of, you know, how do you keep going when a government seems very stuck about things?
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And as well, the fact that you commented on COVID maybe making these stresses and challenges a bit more difficult than what they maybe were beforehand, or in introducing new stresses that you maybe have not experienced before. But yeah, thank you. Michael? Oh, sorry. Yeah. No.
I was just going to add to one of Sally's points that you really need to have grit. You really need to have that sense of perseverance in the face of some of these challenges, which could be working against from a financial point of view. Even in research, you know, you've been thinking about losing a grant and then bouncing back. You shed a tear on the first day, but then you kind of bounce back and you're back in the playing field. So you really need to exercise that level of grit and perseverance. But I'll let Michael take over.
Thank you.
Or Gemma, did you want to go next?
Just because it kind of links on really nicely, like Vaheshtha, I love the go with the flow, and sometimes I think you really have to go with that and balance it out with the perseverance and the grit as well. And just kind of relating to what Sally said about the 3 days, but also sometimes the kind of frustration, and maybe not with the policy making, but more locally. So, for example, in a meeting recently, it was Futures in Mind, and it was about prevention, and it was about building resilient infants. And we were kind of a second thought. It was like, oh, we're getting in touch with you. We forgot, we haven't got representation. And it's brilliant that actually they have remembered, but it just highlights how quickly the voice can be forgotten of the infant, and I guess it's something about maybe going with the flow, or that kind of how do you channel that energy, because you could get really frustrated, or it's like, okay, right, how can we help you to remember, you know, do we need to kind of shout louder, and how do we do that? So it just really resonated with me, Sally, as well, with what you kind of recently said about that channeling the energy. And there's things also about, I guess, recently there's lots of cuts, and I know CAM's been affected, but also our services, and thinking about, you know, can we downband? So we want the same, but with less skilled clinicians. And I guess that can be really challenging, that you can put an argument forward about why it's a specialist service, why it needs these clinicians. But that's all you can do, because people can still choose not to listen. And it's just thinking about, well, then how do we evidence this in the future? You know, how can we kind of be showing that this is what we need in our service? And in some ways, again, that's exciting, because it's like, well, let's be innovative, thinking about how do we produce this evidence where people that do hold the purse strings or the policy making, you know, do listen to kind of different arguments, or they're not quite ready to listen to them, and they might need to listen to them later on, or maybe with a different discussion. And I guess the kind of final bit, which Michael, you've already talked about, is that that we've all been parented, and a lot of us are parents, and I guess that can be sometimes a challenge in terms of the hooks that it takes with us, and how we kind of really need to be understanding about, you know, what is this going on, what does this evoke in us, and what is this maybe about kind of colleagues or families. And I guess a way of really working with that is being able to reflect on that, or have kind of good supervision or support networks in place that help you to really kind of consider that.
Shall I go next? Is that okay? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, well, lots of resonances. Because I want to go out for a drink with everybody in the pub afterwards, but obviously that's not going to happen, or it's going to take us a long time to get to a pub, isn't it? So what led into this work for me, I mentioned it before, the Sure Start local programs, whether the Start for Life initiative that Andrew Ledson's talked about recently will pick up some of the threads and themes from the Sure Start local program. I don't know, it'd be lovely to think it does. I've been around long enough to know that things come in cycles. It'd be lovely to think that early years is kind of coming up to the top of the agenda again. In terms of challenges, it kind of goes, people have mentioned it in various ways, and it goes back to Shelley's introduction. I used to work in a generic CAMS service, and there were specialist teams, and I led the under 7s team. There was a reorganization within that CAMS service, and they got rid of all the specialist teams and said that everybody had to do generic work. So that's at a very local level, and of course, as a foundation trust, they're completely allowed to do that. So I left that service actually without a job to go to, which again reflects kind of my privilege that I'm not independently wealthy, but I could set up in private practice. As it happened, I put in a bid to the Parent Infant Partnership UK, PIP UK at the time, who funded Live PIP, as it used to be called. So now I've got autonomy and freedom, again, which Sally was talking about, part of a small team that I can lead and develop in ways that I think are clinically appropriate. The challenge now is to obtain ongoing funding. So again, if Sally gets that nut cracked, if she can ensure a dedicated stream of funding, I won't have any challenges, and be easy peasy. It's funny how actually the clinical work, and we work with some very troubled families, some really quite risky families. Actually, that doesn't feel like the challenging bit. The challenging bit feels like with people above, the senior managers, commissioners, and policymakers. So no pressure, Sally, but we're relying on you.
Thank you for that. I guess it's just the recurring main challenge from my understanding, is just getting people to listen and to make sure that the voice of the infants isn't lost. And it's how hard it may be to just make sure that the infant's voice is the key facilitator in your perseverance. But thank you so much.
I mean, I think one of the things about these roles is that people alongside their clinical work are having to be advocates all the time. And because it is an emerging field, and services are coming online, very few people, particularly kind of leaders and more senior people, very few of them have been recruited into a job that existed and there was a spec, and they got, most of them have carved their way, proven the point, got a little bit of extra money, got themselves a bit more time to do this work, created a service. A lot of people are creating their job and sustaining their job as well as doing it, constantly having to advocate for those services.
Yeah, definitely. They kind of go hand in hand in this field, I think. We have another question in the chat. I see Michael has commented on it, but I didn't know if any of you had any other comments that you wanted to maybe add. So we have a question about going on to a PhD from studying a master's in experimental psychology, with the view of ultimately becoming a clinical psychologist in parent or infant mental health. And how, with it being competitive, do you have any tips or suggestions as to maybe improve their chances of getting in or getting a place, and just preparing themselves for a PhD in that field?
I mean, I don't have any experience specifically about clinical psychology or PhD, but I guess, you know, from managing and recruiting a lot of people over my career, my kind of biggest tip for whatever you're going for is just talk to the people who are making those decisions and understand more about what you're applying for, what they're looking for. You know, don't feel that there's this kind of power dynamic where you can only interact them through an application form. You know, don't wait to that point. Start the conversation now, find out what they want, what they need, and then you can make sure you're getting that experience, or you're also pitching your kind of application CV in a way that's making the most of it. So so that, you know, for whatever you're thinking of, talk to people, get involved, go and see what the course looks like or feels like, or talk to the tutors, or you know, pick up the phone, find out more, because that will both put you in a better position to apply, but also, you know, it will mean that you might find out other opportunities or other ways in as well.
I guess I could add to that, Imogen, if that's okay. So in terms of a PhD specifically, yes, it's very competitive in terms of the numbers of funded places. There are different ways of embarking on a PhD, but in terms of funding and the availability of funded places, for the number of applicants that we get, the number of places are fairly limited. So how do you improve your chance of getting onto a PhD program? I suppose it's a research-based training. So the first thing would be to show evidence of enthusiasm and engagement in research. If a project has been advertised in relation to infant mental health, having some previous research experience or clinical experience or both would be really useful. Having a publication or having co-authored a publication puts you in a strong position, because it just shows that the work is publishable. But I'm seeing more and more that perhaps a lot of applicants are so similar, which often leaves us thinking who is the best applicant for the particular role. And my suggestion would be, again, show your enthusiasm, show your skill. And when embarking on a PhD, it's a 3-year training. So I guess think carefully, is this something that really pulls at your intellectual and heartstrings, I would say, because it is a major commitment, and it is a challenging time to embark on PhD training. So what makes you different from the other candidates is also something that you might want to ask yourself. And you might want to reflect that within an application, and also within your interview. Often a PhD training position comes with, as we all know, an application, but also the opportunity to interview and to share a range of skill sets, which perhaps one doesn't necessarily, they don't come up on paper, but you have that opportunity to showcase yourself. So bring up and highlight the skills, the attributes, the qualities that really stand you out. So I hope that helps a little bit. Not quite sure who asked the question, but I hope that helps a little bit.
I think it was Jenny, because I guess one of my questions would be, I know she said about going on to do a master's and then a PhD after that, with ultimately wanted to do clinical psychology. So I guess that also is a Declan Sci, which is 3 years on top of that PhD. So if I've got it right in terms of Jenny wanting to eventually get to that pathway, as well as the research, you really have to think about the clinical experience as well. Alongside that would be about a healthcare assistant or assistant psychologists. I know when I was doing my kind of training as well, I ended up doing an assistant psychologist, which can be really competitive, but also doing an honorary assistant. So I wasn't being paid for it, but getting that experience as well. And I guess it's really dependent on whether you're able to do that. You know, you can afford to do that within your kind of career pathway, but it feels like it is quite a long pathway to be thinking about, and that research alongside the clinical experience too.
Yes, and if I may just add to that, often, and I suppose Eleanor, Imogen, and Shelley can chip in here. Often, what I've noticed, I know you're a mature student, but often sometimes students compartmentalize research, clinical work. You know, I would say that there is a fluidity across these so-called research, clinical work, sort of biological work, neuroscience. More so now in the past decade, I think there is fluidity in training, in sort of the understanding and the concepts involved. And when we're really thinking about perinatal and infant mental health, we're really lucky and fortunate now to have that sort of fluidity across boundaries in terms of gaining both research and clinical experience. Often research projects are clinical research studies, so you get the opportunity to work with a specific population in terms of collecting data or trying to answer a specific question. So I think it's also sort of believe in yourself and keep yourself open to a range of different experiences would be my last point.
Just briefly, and I'm not banging a professional drum here, but I understand that Health Education England have increased the number of places on clinical psychology training courses by 25% in the following intake. So that's quite a massive increase. So there's a slight widening of the bottleneck to get onto clinical psychology training courses. So you know, now might be a kind of or next time might be a good time to apply. And the other thing is CYPI app, children, young people's increasing access to psychological therapies courses. There's a 0 to 2 course and there's a 0 to 5 course. So again, they are ways into working with parents and young children from a fairly wide basis entry point.
I think the other thing I would add is, really think about where you want to go and work back about what you need to get there, because accumulating academic qualifications can help with some things, but it doesn't always. And it's you know, it's an expensive way of doing things. So do you really need a master's before you start a PhD or a DClin Psych? You know, are there other ways? In my field, for example, we quite a lot of the time we get students who have done a master's in policy. It doesn't really give you any CV advantage. I'm not saying it's a waste, and for some people it gives them a great understanding and it helps them to understand what they want to go into, and it's been a useful year for them. But in terms of CVs, if I'm comparing CVs, you know, I will look at experience and skills. I don't, in a policy sense, kind of value a master's in public policy above somebody who's spent a couple of years working in a local service or volunteering in it or working in an MP's office. You know, they're all, and so you know, some of these things can be financially quite prohibitive for people. So really, I would, you know, if you want to do it because you love it, do it. You know, I did a master's part-time in the evenings a few years ago, just because I felt like I wanted to update my knowledge, and that worked really well for me. So I'm not saying don't do a master's, it can be great, but understand why you're doing it. If you're doing it because you love it, great. If you're doing it because you need it, great. But don't think you need it. Double check that with where you want to go next.
Amazing, thank you. So I will now hand you over to Shelley for the conclusions, but I'd like to say thank you everyone for asking these questions and generating such an insightful conversation. And thank you guys for answering them. And also just before as well, we have a second set of questions that we'd like you to answer, if that's okay. We'll now pop that in the chat and I will hand you over to Shelley. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Imogen, and to our panelists for the Q&A. Thank you to the audience for sharing your questions. So I guess another thank you to just say for the thought-provoking discussions, and for all our panelists for sharing their experience in the lead up to your role now, as well as in your day-to-day work. And I guess one really important point that came about from the discussion was the aspect of self-reflection on every experience that you have, and also for you to think about what makes you different from other applicants, and as well as having the perseverance and resilience when working in this sector, and also in advocating to give infants a compelling voice. And I also think it was very relevant to the past year and a half, the impact of COVID and how this has affected how you guys have worked. And maybe like this webinar, potentially working virtually might be more effective, or at least I think a lot of people have been talking about a blended approach to working, a mix of face-to-face and online working. And I guess finally, it appears to be really relevant that even with the limited provision or gap in the workforce, the professionals that do work in this field are advocating for infants alongside their day-to-day work. And I guess it's just really important to continue to include infants in the conversation with children as well as adolescents. And I guess the final thing to say is on behalf of Imogen and Eleanor, I'd like to thank our audience for tuning in. And to our four panelists, Vaheshtha, Michael, Sally and Gemma, for taking the time to offer their contributions. And then also, finally, a massive thank you to the Parent Infant Foundation for their support in allowing us to deliver this session today.
Well done, it's fantastic. So for those watching, the three students, Shelley, Imogen and Eleanor, came up with the concept of this event, did all of the organising planning, got us all here and have chaired it wonderfully. So well done, and thank you. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you
so
very
much. Yeah, we hope everyone has a great evening and the great rest of the week. Thank you.
Enjoy the weather.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.